Founded by William the Conqueror in the 11th century, it has since been the home of
The quiet peace of the Windsor estate was shattered at midnight. Prince Edward did the unthinkable. He bypassed King Charles and handed Queen Camilla her eviction papers. This is not a drill, and the moving trucks are already at the gates. Windsor Lodge now belongs to his daughter, Lady Louise. The midnight notice. The heavy iron gates of Bagshot Park swung open precisely at 11:45 at night. A lone black sedan slid out onto the dark, empty road leading toward Windsor Great Park. Inside the vehicle sat a courier carrying a single, thick manila envelope. The document inside bore the official seal of the Duke of Edinburgh. It was not a request for a meeting, nor was it a polite family inquiry. It was a direct, legally binding eviction notice addressed to Queen Camilla. For the past several years, royal residences have been a source of intense behind-the-scenes friction. King Charles has famously tried to manage the vast portfolio of crown estates, often pushing for a more streamlined, cost-effective monarchy. Part of that strategy involved reviewing who lives where. Yet no one expected Prince Edward to take matters into his own hands. The Duke of Edinburgh has spent decades maintaining a quiet, drama-free profile. He has long been viewed as the most compliant and stable of the late Queen Elizabeth's children. That reputation vanished the moment the courier arrived at the security checkpoint of Windsor Lodge. The palace staff on duty looked at the signature on the paperwork and immediately picked up the internal phones. The tension across the estate spiked within minutes. Edward had deliberately chosen a moment when King Charles was resting away from London, dealing with his ongoing medical treatments. By targeting Windsor Lodge, Edward was striking at a property that Queen Camilla had quietly used as a personal, highly guarded sanctuary away from the public eye. The immediate question sweeping through the staff quarters was simple. How could the quietest member of the royal family pull off such an aggressive move? Edward is not the monarch. He does not hold the ultimate authority over crown lands. On paper, King Charles controls the distribution of these historic homes. Yet, the legal team representing the Duke of Edinburgh did not send a vague threat. They issued a hard deadline. The paperwork gave the Queen's personal staff exactly 72 hours to clear her private belongings from the premises. The answer to this legal puzzle lies buried deep in royal history, far back into the mid-20th century. Edward's lawyers had spent months quietly digging through the private archives at Windsor. They were searching for a specific document from the reign of King George VI. During the turbulent years of the 1940s, the royal family restructured how certain smaller estates within the Windsor boundaries were managed. They created specific private trusts to shield certain properties from government oversight and to protect the younger lines of the family. Edward discovered that Windsor Lodge was bound by a unique, wartime tenancy agreement. King George VI had signed a covenant that bypassed the traditional crown estate rules. This specific covenant granted a permanent, hereditary veto power over the lodge to the line of the youngest son. Because Prince Edward was created the Duke of Edinburgh, inheriting his father's title and the historical responsibilities attached to the family's private Windsor properties, the legal veto flipped directly into his hands. Charles's lawyers had completely overlooked this clause during the recent estate audits. Edward found the loophole, verified it with independent constitutional experts, and used it to completely lock Camilla out of the property. With the legal mystery of the eviction notice resolved, an even bigger crisis immediately opened up. The paperwork did not just order Camilla to vacate the premises. It explicitly stated that the property was being immediately transferred to Edward's 22-year-old daughter, Lady Louise Windsor. This detail transformed a standard property dispute into a massive institutional crisis. Giving a prime, highly secure Windsor estate to a young royal who is technically a non-working member of the firm sends a massive shockwave through the palace. It openly defies King Charles's long-term plan for a slimmed-down monarchy. More importantly, it creates an immediate roadblock for the Queen. As the news filtered back to Camilla's inner circle, the true scale of the emergency became clear. The moving trucks were already scheduled to arrive at the gates by dawn. The king was isolated. The legal paperwork was airtight, and Prince Edward had just completely rewritten the rules of family diplomacy. Camilla's empty bastion, two large, unmarked commercial moving vans pulled up to the security barriers at Windsor Lodge at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning. The headlights cut through the thick morning mist, illuminating two royal protection officers standing by the gatehouse. The drivers killed their engines, but left their hazard lights blinking. Within 10 minutes, a sleek metallic gray SUV arrived from the opposite direction, stopping just inches from the lead van. Queen Camilla sat in the front passenger seat, her expression masked by dark sunglasses despite the dim morning light. She rolled down her window and called out directly to the head of the estate security team. The situation escalated instantly because the security gates remained firmly shut. Usually, the Queen's vehicle passes through any royal checkpoint without a single second of delay. This morning, the guard on duty held a clipboard tightly against his chest, refusing to press the electronic release button. He explained that his direct orders came from the private estate office of Prince Edward. The instructions were absolute. No unauthorized vehicles, including those belonging to the Queen, were to enter the perimeter until the scheduled property inventory was complete. This sudden standoff highlights the intense, messy reality of the Crown estate laws. Windsor Lodge is not the personal property of the King or the Queen. It is part of a vast portfolio of lands managed under complex legal frameworks dating back to the Civil List Act of 1760. While the reigning monarch historically enjoys wide authority over who occupies these historic homes, specific pockets of the estate carry ancient localized restrictions. Over the last decade, public scrutiny over royal housing costs has forced the family to tighten controls. However, no one expected these institutional rules to be turned against the Queen Consort so publicly. Camilla did not stay in her vehicle for long. She stepped out onto the damp gravel, flanked by her personal private secretary. She demanded to see the written authorization that could justify blocking her access to her own belongings. The security officer handed over a copy of the wartime covenant signed by King George VI. The document was stamped with a royal seal that had not been used in over 70 years. It was a cold, hard piece of historical reality. The paperwork explicitly stated that the youngest son's line held absolute custody of this specific parcel of land during times of family transition. The confrontation quickly shifted from a legal debate to a battle of wills on the driveway. Camilla's secretary tried to call the main switchboard at Buckingham Palace to get an immediate override from the King's personal staff. The calls went straight to voicemail. The King was staying at Sandringham House in Norfolk that week, undergoing a scheduled block of medical rest. His staff had strict orders to block all non-emergency communications to protect his health. Edward had timed the execution of the notice perfectly, ensuring that the Queen was left entirely without her usual line of immediate royal defense. This brings us to the core mystery of the entire confrontation. Why was Edward willing to risk an open, permanent rift with the King's wife over a single country house? Windsor Lodge is a beautiful property, but it is hardly the grandest estate in the royal portfolio. The building features an unostentatious brick facade, surrounded by dense oak woodlands that provide total privacy from the main tourist paths. It represents something much more valuable than mere square footage. For Camilla, it was a place where she could store her private family archives, personal journals, and gifts collected over decades. Items she did not want mixed with the official state collections. The mystery of Edward's aggression unravels when you look at the specific contents being moved out of the house. As the estate managers finally opened the side doors to let the packing crews inside, they were not looking at standard furniture. They were tracking specific crates of personal papers and historical artifacts. Edward was not just reclaiming a house for the sake of real estate. He was executing a preemptive strike to secure specific historical assets before they could be permanently absorbed into the Queen's private estate. He believed certain items inside belonged exclusively to the late Queen's personal legacy, not to the current sovereign's wife. With that immediate legal hurdle cleared, and the packing crews finally entering the lodge, a new and much larger problem emerged for the palace. The moving vans began loading crates marked with the personal insignia of the House of Windsor. Yet, the destination addresses on the driver's manifests did not list any major royal palace. The paperwork ordered the items to be split between a commercial storage facility in Surrey and a small private cottage on the outer edges of the Windsor estate. This bizarre logistical arrangement immediately triggered a massive wave of questions among the watching staff. Camilla was not just being asked to move her things down the road to a different royal residence. She was being completely stripped of her primary private base of operations within the Windsor perimeter. The Queen was effectively being pushed out of the inner circle of the estate, forced to rely entirely on official staterooms where every single visitor and document is tracked by the wider palace bureaucracy. As the final crates were loaded into the vans, Camilla walked back to her SUV without making another statement. The vehicles turned around and drove away toward London, leaving the driveway of Windsor Lodge empty for the first time in a generation. The gates clicked shut again, but the silence did not last long. Within an hour, a different car arrived at the property, carrying a young woman who was about to inherit the keys to the most controversial house in Britain, the daughter's inheritance. A modest green hatchback pulled up to the front steps of the newly vacated property at exactly 9:30 that morning. Lady Louise Windsor stepped out of the driver's seat, carrying a small leather duffel bag and a set of brass keys attached to a simple blue ribbon. She wore a plain wool coat and sturdy walking boots, looking more like a university student arriving for a term break than a royal taking possession of a major estate. Her father stood by the heavy oak front door, waiting to hand over the official title documents. The transition looked incredibly casual on the surface, but the underlying facts tell a very different story. Louise has spent the last few years focusing heavily on her English literature studies at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. She has deliberately kept a very low profile, rarely appearing at major public engagements unless necessary. Her parents have fiercely protected her privacy, allowing her to grow up largely outside the intense media spotlight that followed her cousins. This sudden move to place her at the center of a high-profile real estate battle represents a massive departure from that long-term family strategy. The tension in the air was palpable as local estate workers watched from the perimeter fences. Rumors were already flying through the village of Old Windsor about why a 22-year-old student needed a historic country house all to herself. The property requires a full team of maintenance staff, constant security monitoring, and significant annual running costs. By placing Louise directly into the house, her father was making a bold statement about her future position within the family hierarchy. It forced the rest of the institution to look at this quiet young woman in a completely new light. This setup immediately created a fascinating mystery for royal observers. Louise has always been vocal about wanting a normal, independent career after she finishes her degree. In past interviews, her mother, Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, openly stated that her children would most likely have to work for a living outside the royal firm. They do not officially use their prince and princess titles, even though they are legally entitled to them under rules established back in 1917. Why then would Louise suddenly agree to accept a property that ties her permanently to the center of palace politics? The answer to that question became clear during a private meeting held in the morning room just an hour after her arrival. Louise did not come to Windsor to live a life of luxury or to abandon her career ambitions. She accepted the house because it solves a massive logistical problem for her university research and her growing involvement with international carriage-driving organizations. The lodge features extensive stabling facilities that were originally upgraded in 2002 for her late grandfather. By taking the keys, Louise secured a vital training base that allows her to maintain her family's historic sporting traditions without relying on the king's personal funding. With that mystery cleared up, a far more dangerous question immediately opened up for the palace administration. As Louise signed the final receipt for the property keys, an official courier vehicle from the Sovereign Grant Office parked in the courtyard. The driver delivered a formal letter from the Treasury Department. The document stated that because the property had transferred to a non-working royal, all state-funded security patrols at the perimeter would cease at midnight. This funding cut created an immediate high-stakes security crisis for the family. The house sits on an exposed corner of the estate, making it a prime target for intruders if left unprotected. Louise's father had clearly anticipated this financial retaliation from London, but the speed of the Treasury's response caught everyone off guard. It was a direct, punitive strike from the Central Palace bureaucracy, designed to make the property unlivable for the young royal before she could even unpack her bags. Louise did not panic when she read the Treasury notice. Instead, she walked out to the stables to inspect the perimeter fences herself, showing the calm resolve that made her a favorite of the late Queen. The local estate managers watched her carefully, waiting to see if she would pack her bags and retreat to her parents' home. Instead of backing down, she placed a direct call to a private security firm staffed entirely by retired royal protection officers. The chess game over the house was far from over, and the younger generation was already proving they knew exactly how to fight back. Behind closed doors at Bagshot Park, while Louise anchored herself at the lodge, Prince Edward returned to his private study at Bagshot Park. The room was lined with old military histories and private family portraits. On his mahogany desk sat a leather-bound logbook containing the exact dates and times of every single property transfer within the Windsor borders for the last 50 years. Edward poured a cup of black tea, sat down, and picked up a secure, encrypted telephone line. He didn't dial Buckingham Palace. Instead, his call went straight to Adelaide Cottage, the residence of Prince William. The alliance between Edward and the Prince of Wales has been quietly building for over 18 months. William has his own strong views on how the royal estates should be distributed as the family looks toward the future. He has grown increasingly concerned about the long-term management of private papers and historic collections housed outside the main state archives. By supporting Edward's move to secure Windsor Lodge, William was effectively protecting the interests of the younger generation. It ensured that key properties remained within the immediate line of succession rather than being controlled by the Queen's personal allies. This behind-the-scenes cooperation introduces a critical mystery to the unfolding drama. Why would William risk angering his father by backing an uncle who just evicted the Queen Consort? The answer lies in a highly sensitive agreement brokered during the Balmoral Summit in 2024. William and Edward had agreed that the traditional lines of the family needed to maintain physical footholds within the Windsor perimeter to guarantee long-term operational security. They realized that if certain properties were leased to commercial tenants or distant relatives, the core security boundary of the castle would be permanently compromised. The true target of Edward's strategy wasn't just a house. It was a calculated effort to establish a precedent. By successfully using the historic George VI Covenant, Edward proved that the reigning monarch does not hold absolute, unchecked power over every corner of the family estate. This legal maneuver effectively created a protective shield around several other smaller properties currently occupied by loyal, working members of the family. It sent a clear message to the palace bureaucrats that any future attempts to displace senior royals would be met with fierce, well-researched legal resistance. Just as this internal dynamic seemed to settle, a massive piece of counterintelligence disrupted Edward's study. A senior advisor from the Duchy of Lancaster office arrived without an appointment. He presented a set of financial ledgers showing that Camilla's legal team had already initiated a countersuit in the High Court. They weren't fighting to get the house back. Instead, they were claiming ownership of the extensive art collection currently hanging in the lodge's main gallery. This sudden legal pivot threw the entire victory into immediate jeopardy. The artwork inside Windsor Lodge includes rare 20th century watercolors and private family portraits that have never been cataloged in the official royal collection. If Camilla's team could prove these pieces were personal gifts rather than crown assets, they could force a public auction or demand millions of pounds in compensation from Edward's private estate. The fight was no longer about brick and mortar. It had transformed into a high-stakes battle over the physical artifacts of royal history. Edward didn't flinch as he reviewed the legal challenge. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a second folder. It contained the original inventory lists from the late Queen's private executors. The documentation proved that every single painting in the gallery had been explicitly catalogued as a permanent fixture of the estate structure itself, making them legally inseparable from the building. Edward handed the papers back to his advisor with a simple instruction to deliver them directly to Camilla's lawyers before the court could open the following morning. The King's Dilemma. At Sandringham House, the atmosphere inside the long library was incredibly tense. King Charles sat in his favorite mahogany armchair, staring blankly at a stack of morning newspapers laid out on a low coffee table. Every single front page carried identical, bold headlines detailing the sudden eviction at Windsor Lodge. His personal medical team had spent the early hours of the morning advising him to avoid any stressful confrontations. They emphasized that elevated stress levels could actively hinder the efficacy of his ongoing medical treatments. Yet, the unfolding reality of open, legal warfare between his youngest brother and his wife made quiet rest completely impossible. The king faced a brutal, high-stakes institutional choice. It was a dilemma that would define the public perception of his modern reign. Charles found himself caught squarely between two completely opposing, immovable forces. On one side stood his deep personal loyalty to Queen Camilla. She had supported him unconditionally through the most difficult years of his transition from Prince of Wales to the throne. She was his primary source of emotional stability, managing her own heavy schedule of public duties while keeping a watchful eye on his health. On the other side stood his profound respect for constitutional law and the historical agreements signed by his grandfather. His senior advisors from the Privy Council were already pacing the hallways of the estate. They were warning him that trying to overturn Prince Edward's wartime covenant through a hasty royal decree could trigger a massive parliamentary debate. It threatened to expose the legal limits of the monarch's personal power over crown lands. The most baffling element of the entire crisis was the king's initial total silence. For 48 hours, the central press office at Buckingham Palace refused to issue anything but a generic one-line statement. They repeatedly told inquiring journalists that property matters within the estate were a private family concern. Royal commentators across London were completely mystified by the lack of an immediate, aggressive defense of the Queen from the sovereign himself. Why was the reigning monarch allowing his brother to openly dictate who could live within the boundaries of his own royal park? The explanation for this uncharacteristic hesitation lay buried in the private medical journals tracked by his personal physicians since early 2025. The hard physical reality was that Charles simply did not possess the energy or the institutional capital to fight a protracted, messy legal battle against his own flesh and blood. He realized that a public feud would completely overshadow the important charitable work and state duties he was trying to maintain during his recovery. More importantly, his top constitutional lawyers had spent the night reviewing the paperwork sent from Bagshot Park. They confirmed that Edward's legal framework was absolutely airtight. If the king tried to use his sovereign authority to force Lady Louise out of the property, Edward's legal team was fully prepared to take the matter to an open court. Such a move would expose decades of private family financial agreements to intense public scrutiny. This legal roadblock introduced a secondary, highly sensitive mystery to the king's dilemma. Charles's advisors discovered that the wartime covenant didn't just protect the property lines of Windsor Lodge. It also contained specific clauses regarding the distribution of historical assets held within the home. If the king fought the eviction, he risked triggering an automatic audit of several other properties currently occupied by senior royals. This audit had the potential to reveal that multiple residences were operating under outdated, legally vulnerable agreements. Edward hadn't just secured a house for his daughter, he had effectively built a legal minefield around the entire estate management system. He knew the king's advisors could not afford to detonate it. The king spent hours pacing the formal gardens of Sandringham, weighing the survival of the institution against his natural desire to protect his wife's dignity. He looked at old photographs of his grandfather, King George VI, trying to understand the original intent behind the 1940s trust agreements. Charles eventually realized that fighting a losing battle in the public eye would cause permanent damage to the monarchy's reputation. The public, already dealing with a tense economic climate, would have very little sympathy for senior royals arguing over multi-million-pound country houses. The stability of the crown had to come before any personal grievances or hurt feelings within the marriage. As the second afternoon of the crisis drew to a close, Charles made his final decision. He returned to his private study and summoned his principal private secretary to the desk. He issued a direct, unnegotiable order to halt all legal counteractions currently being prepared by the Duchy of Lancaster office. He chose to accept Edward's terms, recognizing that preserving the long-term dignity of the royal family was far more important than winning a temporary domestic dispute. He picked up his fountain pen and quietly signed a formal executive order. The document officially confirmed Lady Louise's residency at the lodge, effectively ending the immediate legal standoff, but leaving a deep, unhealed scar within his inner circle. This quiet surrender immediately opened a final, lingering question about the future of the monarchy's centralized leadership. By stepping back and letting Edward's aggressive move stand, Charles signaled a massive shift in how the family functions behind closed doors. The traditional absolute authority of the reigning monarch was quietly beginning to decentralize. The younger lines of the family, operating with the tactical support of Prince William, were successfully carving out their own independent zones of permanent security. They were establishing their footholds before the next reign could even begin. The king's dilemma was resolved, but the traditional power structure of the palace was gone forever. A new power dynamic in the Windsor Woods. The physical reality of the transition became completely undeniable by Friday morning. The heavy commercial moving vans had entirely vanished from the long driveway of Windsor Lodge, leaving only faint tire tracks on the damp gravel. In their place stood a private plainclothes security detail, patrolling the perimeter oak woods on foot and in small all-terrain vehicles. Lady Louise Windsor was officially settled into her new ground floor study. Her university textbooks, literature notes, and equestrian notebooks were now stacked neatly on the fitted mahogany shelves where Queen Camilla's private journals and correspondence files had rested just days before. The landscape of royal power had been permanently, decisively rewritten under the cover of a single week's morning mist, changing the geography of the estate forever. Camilla remained firmly entrenched at Clarence House in London, focusing her entire energy on her official state duties and refusing to schedule any weekend breaks at the Windsor estate. Her inner circle viewed the entire episode as a bitter, deeply personal betrayal. They considered it a calculated corporate strike, timed specifically to exploit a moment of profound family vulnerability while the king was away recovering. The personal relationship between the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh's branch of the family was permanently fractured, creating a cold, silent barrier that would inevitably influence every state banquet, holiday gathering, and private family event for years to come. Court insiders reported that seating arrangements for upcoming autumn events were already being quietly redrawn to ensure the two factions would not have to interact directly. The ultimate validation of Prince Edward's bold strategy came directly from Prince William. On Friday afternoon, the Prince of Wales made a quiet, entirely unannounced visit to the property, taking the back roads from Adelaide Cottage to avoid the public eye. He did not bring an official communications team, a press officer, or a large convoy of security vehicles. He arrived driving his own estate car, carrying a simple housewarming gift for his younger cousin. The message to the wider palace bureaucracy was loud and clear. The future king fully approved of the new residency arrangement, cementing Louise's place at the geographic heart of the estate and ensuring that the Wessex line remained a vital, permanent part of the monarchy's physical future. This silent endorsement from the heir to the throne completely paralyzed any lingering plans for a palace counterstrike. With William openly backing Edward, the traditional court factions realized that any further attempts to challenge Louise's tenancy would be entirely futile. The move effectively signaled the dawn of a new administrative era. It was an era where the younger generation of royals was no longer content to wait for invitations or central assignments from the crown. Instead, they were actively securing their own borders, managing their own assets, and protecting the historical legacy of the late Queen through precise legal means. The power shift quickly rippled through the rest of the royal household staff. Workers at the estate notice boards observed new duty rosters being pinned up, reflecting the updated security protocols under Louise's independent team. The local land agents who had previously answered directly to the Central Crown authorities were now routing their paperwork through the Bagshot Park estate office. This logistical change meant that a significant portion of the Windsor parkland was operating outside the immediate oversight of Buckingham Palace administrators. The traditional lines of communication had been bypassed, leaving the institutional managers in London scrambling to update their organizational charts. Meanwhile, the public reaction to the news began to take shape as details leaked to the British press. Rather than sparking outrage over royal property distribution, the narrative shifted toward a story of a young woman stepping into a historic family role. Louise's reputation as a hard-working, grounded student worked heavily in her favor. Commentators noted that her deep passion for carriage driving made her the perfect custodian for a property so closely tied to her late grandfather's sporting life. The palace press office, finding themselves unable to reverse the situation, quietly allowed this positive public framing to take hold, effectively neutralizing any remaining leverage the Queen's allies had hoped to use. As the weekend arrived, the true depth of the new dynamic was fully established. The lodge was no longer a hidden archive for the Queen's private collections. It had transformed into an active, independent outpost for a rising branch of the family. The alliance between Edward and William had created a protective shield that not even the highest offices of the crown could penetrate. The The traditional centralized authority that had governed the Windsor properties for generations had been broken by an old wartime covenant and a family determined to claim their space. The woods around the lodge were quiet once again, but the institutional balance of the House of Windsor had changed forever.